Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. We are live today, and by live, I mean Matt and I are in the same state.
In the studio.
Brought to you by...
Cooking it up. Bean style. Niximulation style.
Yeah, so today we're going to do some fun stuff because we are live. Probably when this comes out, we'll have already dropped it, but we are going to record immediately after this some sweet Patreon exclusive content, which we never do.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real exciting day for everyone involved.
It's a blessing upon us all.
It is. And today we're going to bless you with some real sweet niche content. Wow, that was weird.
Wasn't even planned.
It wasn't. Today we're going to talk about the honey locust, the sweetest of the locusts, some might say.
Some might. Sweetest of the locusts. That's a pretty high bar, that kind of name.
Yeah, and we're going to learn about it. So for folks that are not familiar with us, welcome back, or welcome to the Poor Proles Almanac. If you don't know who we are, then shouldn't be saying back. And today we're talking about your favorite tree, maybe. Now, honey locusts. When people know honey locusts, there's usually one of two reasons for that. Well, three. We'll give it three. So you've got the urbanites who live in cities where honey locusts were planted 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and they recognize the weird trees by their kind of greenish bark, and if they have pods on them, and they're like, what is that? So they might know them for that reason. The other one is people that have lived out in the country and have seen these trees, and they drop their little spikes, and they just go through your shoe, your tractor's tire, your entire house, maybe. Those things can do some damage.
Yeah, I like that honey locust was brave enough to ask the question, what if we could put spike strips on the sidewalk? You know what I mean?
For everyone, really. It's nature's gift to us.
Mm-hmm. Nature's caltrop.
There you go. Now, before modern times, the anachronistic honey locust really relied on the Pleistocene megafauna to expand its range, similar to our good friend the Kentucky coffee tree, which we covered a few months ago back.
Yeah, just how long ago was that? Feels like years.
Feels like years. Might have been. I mean,
might have been years.
Recording wise, I think it was like 6 weeks ago. But
okay,
for listeners,
kind of a bad time warp.
Yeah, we don't. So here's the thing you have to understand about this podcast: we have a very organized system of release. We have a very disorganized system of recording.
Mm-hmm.
So while this is coming out in January, I believe, we've also recorded stuff that's coming out in like June.
This is why I think we should get into more timely political content, because I think whatever we say about stuff will have always aged well and always be correct.
Exactly, especially the day it comes out.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, let's get into this. So when we're talking about the honey locust, we're talking about a tree that before human settlement historically occupied like open and often rocky, dry upland areas, primarily east of the Rocky Mountains. Now, as those Pleistocene animals faced extinction, there were these weird two-legged or what is the word I'm looking for here?
Bipedal,
upstanding gentlemen.
Yes.
Young men and women.
Yeah. Lads
and ladettes that showed up, and they were like, hey, this thing's kind of cool. It makes sugary pulp, and it's kind of got these thorns that we can do cool stuff with.
Nature's
caltrops. Interesting fact, I didn't write this down for the Substack piece, but there's some very, very tangential, not confirmed evidence of the honey locust thorns being used for tattooing.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
That's cool.
That is some interesting speculation.
Yeah, I love it. I'm like, oh man, now I want to get one.
A honey locust point tattoo.
Do you get the pod if you get the honey locust point tattoo so everyone knows? Like, and they're like, what is that? You can say it's a honey locust pod. I got it done with a honey locust thorn.
Yeah, I guess, if you want to have the tattoos that you have to, like, explain it. Well, I guess maybe you want to talk about the honey locust thorn.
Yeah, maybe just get a thorn tattoo with the honey locust thorn.
Mm-hmm.
Like a barbed wire tattoo, but it's honey locust thorns.
Oh, yeah. Very, very edgy.
Very, very 2024. Very niche, like many things we do.
Very niche.
So the whole point of like the speculation, one of the things that should be really obvious for anyone that's interested in honey locusts and has done a little bit of digging, is that academic writing on traditional uses is quite limited. And then even going further back into like indigenous use of the plant, it's even more limited. We had Dr. Robert Warren on the podcast probably 3 or 4 years ago now, and he was talking about this idea from his research with ants that actually, despite wet regions being where most of the honey locusts are today, that's not actually a good representation of how honey locusts were once on the landscape. That the plant, much like when we were talking about the Kentucky coffee tree, isn't really suited for wet regions, but because of indigenous land management, they were brought into those spaces. He makes the case that basically all of the honey locusts going up the Cherokee region were actually cultivated by the Cherokee, planted by the Cherokee, and created what he calls a cultivation legacy, in that its distribution patterns are because of human management and not their natural range.
Makes sense.
So the question is, why was this so important?
I mean, do I have to say it again? Nature's caltrop.
I mean, maybe, but also there's probably a little bit more to it
I
than
don't
that.
think so.
No, you're
I
sold.
think we can wrap up the episode here.
We're done.
It's done.
Matt's ready for that Patreon content.
Folks, you're here for the shortest ever episode of the Poor Proles Almanac. I think we should just... I can't stand it. I gotta go.
I need it, but I don't want it. Kind of that situation, which I get. We're like medicine a little bit.
Yeah.
Like bad medicine.
Yeah. It's like medicine where it's like it might... It's like when they... when you had like a toothache and they would then get you hooked on opium. It's like
So we're opium?
I guess just as an example. Yeah, could be. But just something that might do you more harm than that sort of medicine.
Okay. All right. I see that. But to get back to this honey locust, which is the
That's
reason
what
we're here for,
about.
and we're not done with, Matt, I'm sorry. We spent a lot of this season talking about these anachronistic trees, the Kentucky coffee tree, the pawpaw, and how, for at least the Kentucky coffee tree, a lot of the species that they co-evolved with, other animals, insects, and so on, a lot of them don't exist anymore, and honey locusts are no different. However, there's this really interesting little like tidbit that I really enjoy about the honey locust, and it has to do with the honey locust moth, which still exists.
Hit me with this.
Now, what's really interesting and special to me when we're talking about the honey locust moth is that it specifically feeds on the Kentucky coffee trees as a caterpillar and on the honey locust as a moth. So it connects these two forgotten species, these anachronistic trees that kind of have no other place on the landscape. It's kind of like this little like triangle of love between the three. Isn't that so pretty?
That's so sweet. They really yearn for that Kentucky coffee tree, honey locust ecosystem.
Yeah, it's the bean moth.
It's the bean moth.
It really should be.
Is
just
that what it's called?
No, it's not. It's just the
What's
honey
it
locust.
called?
It's called the honey locust moth.
I'll look it up.
You're gonna doubt me on my bean moth?
No.
Science?
I don't doubt you. Oh, it's pretty.
Thank you, Matt.
It's guys, go look it up. It's like pink.
Trust me, bro.
It's like orange and a little bit of pink. Kind of clashes actually. Actually, it's kind of ugly.
Slaps.
It's disgusting and foul.
Like much of nature is just disgusting and foul.
I'm kind of over that now.
Okay.
What's next?
All right. So as I was saying before, these trees seem to follow the Cherokee settlements, and this includes several disjunct populations of honey locusts, similar to what we saw last season with the chinkapins, where there's these disjunct populations, which would suggest that indigenous management brought them to these new locations. So for the honey locust, what is the reason that they're valuable? A big reason why they're valuable is not the caltrops, Matt, but the sugary pulp inside the locust pods. For most of the honey locust range, it's too far south for maple syrup, so this is basically another example of a tree that can offer a reliable perennial source of sugar.
Probably.
Not sold?
I mean that sounds right.
Caltrops.
Is that could be caltrops? Is that like? Do we have resources to like back that up?
Yeah. So what's
is this more speculation?
Wild speculation with no basis. Yes, we do a lot of that, but not
we're
right
thinking
now.
of renaming the podcast.
Fox News.
Yeah, wild speculation with no basis. Yeah.
We do know that indigenous people use what's it called?
Caltrops.
Yeah, the caltrops, the pulp. But what we seem to have lost largely is any evidence of how it was processed. However, we do have some like ideas based on how other similar crops are harvested, how a continued history of how it's utilized today might suggest how people had seen it being used and then applied it to a modern world. And it's worth noting that, as we're talking about these different processing methods, there is limited storage evidence. So it is very possible that they were just consuming it fresh. It was a seasonal thing to enjoy.
Like candy corns.
Like candy corn. You have it for 3 days and then you never want to see it again.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next year comes around. You're like, actually, what sounds fantastic right now? A big chunk of triangle.
Yeah, how did they get us to eat that much wax? It's just so much, isn't it? Just like wax?
Is it? I don't know a whole lot about candy corn.
Waxy.
I only found out recently that you can stack them to make a corn.
Oh, interesting.
Did you know that?
They're like candy corn kernels.
Yeah, and you
They're
stack
not,
them in
like,
a circle
so-
and they'll like tower up.
Interesting. Like a Fibonacci like flowering sequence, but for candy corns.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Exactly. You got it. I was trying to figure out a way to say Fibonacci with maize in it, and then it came out Fibonacci, and I was like, nope, that's wrong.
Yeah, Fibmaze-nachi.
Yeah, I got nothing for that one.
I feel like it's a bit of a... We can move on.
Yeah, we don't. This is not that important. Let's get into this consumption. So, like I said, while I'm saying that there's limited evidence of storage, we do have some evidence, written evidence, that the pulp was just scraped out of the pods and consumed directly. There's some documentation from colonists arriving, describing indigenous people utilizing it that way, which would suggest at least that is a way it was consumed. And like I said, this would make it more of a treat than like a staple in Cherokee diets. Alternatively, it's possible that the pods were boiled, the sugar was mixed into a syrup that could be cooked further and granulated, similar to like a maple sugar. This would also create a mush. Now, from my experience of messing around with these and some folks that I have shared experiences with on trying to utilize this as a potential crop, this liquid tends to be very sweet, but also very tannic. However, anecdotally, from, like I said, other folks I've talked to that have tried this, selected honey locust varieties, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, seem to leave less residual tannin in the liquid, which would suggest that there's some real potential to breed out some of that tannic issue for processing the sugar this way.
Okay, I got you. So you have like, after this process, you get the mush, and you get the secondary liquid, and if you're using like selected varieties, the liquid is like a honey locust, milk?
Yeah, pod milk is what you're saying, right?
Oh.
Milk the pod.
Please don't refer to it as pod milk. Ugh.
So processing them this way is simple. You simply cut the edge away from the seeds where most of the gum and the sugar is, and boil while mashing until the water is cloudy and thick with that pulp. Then take the pods and the mash out, drain them through a cheesecloth. That mush, that's what you're going to try to utilize. And you can kind of pick out those pods before processing it any further. They're very big. It's not like a ton of seeds. It's not going to take you a huge amount of time.
How many seed per pod are we talking here?
Depending on the variety, there's quite a bit of a range between usually 12 and 20.
Okay.
So
and a pod's like what, like 9 inches?
like a lima, the pod itself, between 9 and, depending on the variety, it can be between like 4 and 17 inches, 18 inches. Now those 4 are like ones that are being bred to not have pods.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, if you're talking about ones that you want to work with for this purpose, they're probably going to be at least 9 or 10 inches. Yeah. So you're going to do this. Then you get this mush, right? This pulp, this mush has this really interesting mix of like overripe banana and cacao flavor. People have tried to use it as a chocolate substitute, but it doesn't seem to really convert the way you would expect it to or hope it to. So sorry, this is not going to be your chocolate substitute. You're going to have to rely on the American basswood for that.
I think we're going to have to start trying to market this in like a protein shake.
Protein shake?
You know,
Going
like
back to the
banana
bean.
and chocolate, I feel like is such a staple for the bro shake.
Yeah, but there's no protein in it. That's the problem.
Lie? We could lie.
We could lie.
We could lie.
See, I thought you meant LYE at first, and I was like,
no.
you want to nixtamalize it further?
Yeah.
Okay, we could try that. I'm not sure what it's doing about protein, but let's do it.
fraud, really,
Fraud.
in and
Tax fraud,
and
business fraud, just general fraud.
advertising, misinformation, sort of culture, Enron-esque for sure. Yeah, I think this could be fun.
This could be fun.
We just got to do it in the time between when we record this and when this comes out.
When we have to hear this on the courthouse, yeah. So this pulp with this interesting flavor profile can be dehydrated further into a very like granular-esque, very easily to break fruit leather. While I'm not aware of anyone that's tried to, I think there could be some potential to like break this down further into like more of a shelf-stable, like granular sugar type thing.
I feel like it would be really good on like shattered sugar on like a topping of a baked good, perhaps.
Possibly.
It's sweet and just like flaky.
Maybe.
It's like that fancy salt, but sweet and brown.
So what I'm hearing is that we need to just get into selling wild foods as like ingredients.
Yes. I guess that sounds like a lot more work than I was kind of intending.
Oh, so you just want to like promise things and not do them.
That's...
We're a podcast.
I thought that was the whole point of having a podcast.
Yeah, so to get back to like these utilizations of the honey locust, in Appalachian culture, these honey locust pods are mixed with persimmon to make a fermented like beer-esque drink. It's not technically beer because there's no hops in it. For the beer snobs here, there are four critical ingredients.
Of an ale?
Like a braggot probably would be like the some.
What the fuck did you just call me?
A braggot.
Oh my god! You hear this, world?
Yes, exactly. You heard it here first. The bigot with the braggot.
That's the new podcast name.
Dropping soon. Given the overlapping ecosystems of like the honey locust and the persimmon, I guess like the idea that they would be utilized in this way, especially given like the ubiquity of the persimmon as like this really common fruit, which we haven't covered yet. We are getting there. I promise you that it would make sense. Outside of the food use of the honey locust, for anyone that has worked with honey locust as a tree, wood is really great for heating, has higher BTUs even compared to oak. The tree limbs were used for making weapons because it has really strong wood, similar to like the Osage orange or the black locust, or basically any of those. I feel like all of the anachronistic trees are pretty dense woods, with the exception of pawpaw.
Well, yeah, that's kind of interesting because think about they like have to withstand, or they had to withstand getting like torn up and picked. So I guess not having a wood that like won't like split when the tree's like getting like jostled around.
Yeah,
could be really important. But yeah, and we're like, and we're using it for weapons.
Yeah.
What sort of weapons?
I'm guessing like bows and and probably spears and
interesting,
and, like probably like tomahawks, stuff like that.
Beating the shit out of someone with like a honey locust shillelagh.
Yeah, like with that like very pretty yellow wood on it. Like,
what's that? That guy on TikTok that like does all the woodworking. That's very not specific. Yeah, that's the guy. And he always talks about the like some like lamination that's like in the wood. Just like pointing that out before you beat someone with it.
Yeah, there's there's
potential here.
There is. If I'm gonna get an axe to death, it better be a hickory like handle. I don't want some fucking synthetic plastic shit. Like,
right.
I want to be looking at that grain and be like, that was a nice tree.
Yeah, and I wish you luck when that time comes.
Yeah, in the first Water Wars, I'm assuming I'll go in the first one.
Yeah. Jesus Christ, what is this, pine?
Don't embarrass me. Dishonor on your friends, dishonor on your family, dishonor on your cow.
When's that from?
Mulan.
Oh. I was never a Mulan girly.
Sorry. They're not going to make a man out of you, I guess.
Clearly.
So honey locust has, since like indigenous use and like kind of like the Appalachian like rural usage of it as this like beer type thing, its first real exposure as like this potential tree crop comes from our good buddy J. Russell Smith.
Who else?
In his very famous book Tree Crops, talking about its potential as a livestock feed, human feed, ethanol production, all those fun things. And then John Hershey went and went to work for the TVA and started working with the tree, and also wrote quite a bit about why it was this fantastic tree, which we're going to get to in a minute. Now, while with the TVA and around the same period, there's several competitions that are run to identify improved selections. So the American Genetic Association, which you may remember from, I believe it was J. Russell Smith's episode, we talked about it, or yeah, I believe it was, that there was work being done on several plants to identify native plants with improved selections. This is one of the ones that they did do that we're talking about today. And in it, they ended up getting entries from 36 states. And the pods had a significant variety in characteristics. However, the best pods, generally speaking, seem to have come from the South.
Which is interesting, because I feel like when we've talked about these competitions before, a lot of the top contenders were coming from the Midwest.
Yeah, so this is a nice, like, the South will win for once kind of thing.
Okay.
they got this
they
one,
can
and that
have
was
the
it.
honey locust.
Yeah. So the first competition, while I mentioned the American Genetics Association being in 1936, I believe, the first competition was in 1934. The Southern Agriculturalist, a regional magazine, advertised the competition for the TVA, and yet despite high interest, only 17 entries were actually submitted for judging. The three winners were Calhoun, Torbit, and Millwood.
Those sound like some Southern names. And I've heard of two of them, but not Torbit.
And that would make sense because the first two are comparatively thornless, while the latter was a very thorny tree. So at the time where we didn't know a whole lot about its genetics, it made the most sense to focus on the tree that had similar qualities except with less thorns.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where a lot of the research stayed. Now, more contests continued through the late 1930s, but there were no like significant improvements found in any of the trees. And that's not to say the competitions were fruitless. There were new varieties that were found that had like really interesting traits like fruit clustering and unusually thick pods, which were propagated on a limited basis for future breeding, and in many cases have basically been largely lost.
Womp womp.
Womp womp. Now we have some data on those selections up on the Substack, so check out agroecologies.org if you'd like to see the old appendices from like the 1930s and 40s.
And shout out to the YMCA of the Rockies, which for some strange reason held a consortium on tree crops for energy production, where that appendix actually came from.
Yeah, they literally have, as they like to say, everything for a young man to enjoy.
And you can hang out with all the boys. And by boys, I mean honey locusts, obviously.
Obviously. And it gives a whole new meaning to Saturdays are for the boys.
Saturdays are for the pods.
For the pods?
For the pods.
The pods and the pods.
Yeah, sorry.
We're podding.
Mm-hmm.
Planting pods and listening to pods.
Yep. Get after it, listeners.
Get after it. Now, the TVA did work to study the potential, the utility of these honey locusts. Like I said, from the sugars for human consumption to feed value of pods to silvopasture and its potential as a landscape tree, its ability to produce ethanol based on the pod sugars because they were so high. They ran some very rudimentary early studies showing that like calves and rats, so I don't know why, the big two, were able to consume and thrive on honey locust meal as opposed to like cornmeal, and found that while it was slightly less efficient, it did prove to be a viable food source. These studies were done with common pods, not improved selections, so there was potential for even better results if they'd had those tree crops fully developed to like study further.
Yeah, and also like competing against like fully developed corn.
Yeah, so
or fully improved.
Yeah, like taking a crop that's been domesticated for thousands of years and then comparing it with a wild plant. Like if they're in the same ballpark, that's a really good sign for that other crop, especially with corn, which is like, as we've talked about on the show, leagues ahead of every other crop. It's like not even really a competition. So that's pretty cool.
And you're telling me this makes firewood as well?
And it makes firewood.
And shillelaghs?
And yes.
Clubs? And caltrops?
Especially the caltrops. Another interesting thing is that they substituted the honey locust pods for oats on a dairy farm. For folks that are familiar with cows, dairy production is probably one of the most picky areas for energy put into livestock. So like if you can match there, you're doing something really good. And what they found when feeding the honey locust pods is that there was no drop in milk production over 2 years, which highlights like this strong nutritional profile that these are a legitimately nutritious thing to be feeding livestock.
Wow. Where can I find some like honey locust fed cheese?
Ugh.
Like, give me like cheese from the pod.
The
I want pod to cheese production. Is that? Can you find that for me, or
I can't.
Can you do that for?
But
can you start doing that?
Yeah, we like you can get like honey goat cheese. We're gonna get honey locust goat cheese.
Yeah,
honey locust. Do it. Say it.
Oh, I said it. I said honey loat.
Oh, I thought you were gonna say honey locust honey goat cheese. So you got the honey locust and the honey. You're doubling up on the honey. It's super sweet.
And you never know. Maybe someone's listening to this and does do that. And maybe they'll send us some honey locust. Honey goat. No, not a honey goat. A honey locust. Honey. Oh.
Goat cheese. You got it. You got it, buddy. Have faith.
I think we got to move on.
Yeah. So outside of food, studies have shown that the pod sugar content is also very suitable for ethanol fermentation. And what's significant about this is that it can put marginal farmlands to use with a native crop. So it has all the ecological benefits while also putting a plant that does really well in really poor soils. Again, something we've talked about a lot on this season is like leveraging plants that do well in poor soils. This research has continued today and is still quite promising, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. The TVA also began to work to breed improved selections, starting with those winners of the competition that we talked about earlier. Through the 1930s, research was done to better understand how pollination and cross-pollination worked with honey locusts. And what they found was that there was very little incompatibility. What this means is that future breeding work would produce significant viable seed. So for folks that like have apple trees and it's like timing blooms and stuff like that, that's not really an issue with honey locusts. They cross-pollinate really well. There's no issues of other, not just timing, but like other issues because of like being genetically very similar or anything like that. And it meant that like controlled breeding of selections would be very easy to do, comparatively speaking, to a lot of other crops.
And that is why so much improvement has been made.
Hasn't been made.
Hasn't been made on honey locust?
We'll get there. So in 1939 and 1940, work was being done to identify if scion wood from trees would carry its thorny traits. What they found was that thorny scion wood would become thornless after grafting 18% of the time, partly thorny would become thornless over 50% of the time, and thornless scion wood would produce thorny trees less than 4% of the time. This meant that selections of improved trees, even if thorny, could be propagated as thornless clones using scion wood from branches that had ceased thorn production. The takeaway here should be that thorniness is not a significant factor in identifying selections for future use.
Okay, so in regard to Torbut, like, we fucked up?
Yeah. I mean,
Torbut.
Its genetics would be on par with other selections, and it would have maybe added some unique flavors to the catalog of honey locusts. Like we talked about banana and cacao, but some have like some more tropical-y flavors. So it's possible those flavors would have been in there. I'm not familiar enough to say any further. During the same period, John Hershey was busy drafting up a book on honey locust research. Now, this book was never finished or published. Oh, it may have been finished. I think the first draft was done before he died. So it was basically unknown of. Fortunately, the drafts were stored by a guy named Greg Williams out in Kentucky. And together with Zach Elfers, we've made this draft available on our Substack as a PDF. In his drafts, he describes stories of roasted seeds and fermented pod drinks for human consumption.
Just going back a second to those like unique flavors that might have been like around those thorny varieties. I wonder like how that would have come through like in like the roasted seeds, or like, you know, if it would be like a significantly different like in the drinks.
You're thinking about that bracket, aren't you?
I don't like. It's rude, Andy. I don't like to say it.
Just embrace it, Matt. Mm-hmm. It's 2024.
Mm-hmm.
Reclaim it.
Reclaim the brackets.
Reclaim it for your ancestors, Matt.
My braggot ancestors,
Yeah.
my braggot drinking ancestors.
Yes, you're English. There's a lot of braggots back in the day in the English world. That's what they say.
Say that again. Say that one more time, man.
Yeah.
I'll beat your ass.
Now, John also details the research the TVA was doing with honey locusts, and one of the things he mentions is grinding the pods whole, and noted that the pod shell itself carried most of the bitterness. What he described as the fine powdery dust that remained in this grinding process contained, in his words, the highest flavor of sugar and the least bitter. They trialed making muffins with a mix of yellow corn and millwood honey locust flour at a 2-to-1 ratio, corn to honey locust, which he described as tasting quote-unquote fine, with some consumers describing the muffins as surprisingly too sweet.
Too sweet. Are they too fluffy? Too full of love?
Too delicious.
Too delicious?
Yeah.
Give me a break. If I would have had them, off the charts.
Off the charts. Yeah, so I think that's promising considering people didn't know what they were doing. It's like, let's just see what happens if we add this, because based on the sugar, it probably should be around this much, but we don't actually know. And they created something that people weren't disgusted with.
Yeah, which is a nice contrast to the Kentucky coffee tree coffee, which we talked about a little earlier.
0 out of 10.
0 out of 10
For everyone.
Poor Kentucky coffee tree.
Our buddy, R.I.P. in peace.
KCT.
Now, he concluded that the honey locust offered crop yields above corn when working with improved selections, specifically millwood that he was focused on as a livestock feed, although the pods had potential for human consumption as well, as we've been pointing to. He was really, really sold on the idea that the honey locust was a future staple crop for American agriculture, and that's something that obviously hasn't happened yet.
What about all those rolling fields of honey locust trees? Did I just dream that? It's all just one beautiful dream.
Yes.
Ugh. I mean, and I'm sure this is like also totally unrelated to all the other crops that were like this that were getting developed, and then the 1940s happened and corn took over.
One more thing the Nazis took from us.
Mm-hmm. So true. Local. Yeah. This is what they took from you. And it's a pod. It's a bean.
There's the bumper sticker. This is what they took from you. Now, many of the ongoing honey locust pasture programs from this time period ended up being discontinued, including many of the fields managed by the TVA. However, they weren't all bulldozed or anything like that. Rogue populations have continued to survive into the 70s and even today. In regards to the loss of interest, that began to shift again in the 1970s as the oil embargo of 1973 forced people to reconsider the input-output costs of our farming systems.
I mean, we talked about this like pretty extensively with the Odom brothers last season. About the Odom brothers last season. They're dead.
They're dead.
Unfortunately.
They don't get to know about the history of corn today.
They can't come on the podcast.
Nope. Not going to be guests. I want to tell them all about corn.
Or we could get, I mean...
Corn with a K.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, maybe if we did a seance podcast, you could very well introduce them.
I wonder how they would handle Freak on a Leash.
Well. Yeah, I think they'd be into it.
Probably.
Yeah.
Into those dissonant sounds of weird. Mm-hmm. 10 out of 10. No notes.
0 out of 10.
Yeah. This is what
I have
you
a
get.
Spreadsheet.
This is what you get for inspiring Bill Mollison.
Yeah, exactly.
It's 2 decades of corn's greatest hits. Now, in 1979, around the same time as the Odom brothers, a guy named Dr. James Hanover at Michigan State University picked up where Smith left off, looking to provide more insight into the species variation of the honey locust. While Hanover worked with honey locust, his focus was more broadly on generally biomass production for energy. In 1974, he founded the Michigan Cooperative Tree Improvement Program, which brought together, tree breeders, tree workers, tree researchers, nurseries, all these different groups to focus on developing poplar, aspen, and black locust. And he oversaw a large-scale black locust breeding program.
This was all at McTip?
At McTip, yes. At getting the tip.
I wish I hadn't brought that up.
Despite this successful career with these trees, the honey locust never shows up again in any of his research, except in passing to Smith's work.
Hmm.
I had been waiting and waiting and waiting to finish this episode until the last minute because we had reached out to the MSU Archives Department to see if I could track down more information about this work. And as of this recording, I haven't heard any definitive answers back. But if we do, we will be updating the Substack with that information.
This also means, unfortunately, we've had to move on to the sort of next step of information gathering, which is we're going to... What were we talking? We were talking about besieging the archives.
Yes. We're putting those caltrops to work.
Right. We were going to try to gain access by any means necessary to the to the pod research.
Violence first.
Yes. Well, no. A series of polite emails first, then violence. Then
a letter campaign.
Then the letter campaign. Yeah. Then the letter campaign.
Yeah, what could go wrong? So what we're saying very explicitly is if you're near MSU, you have a very specific job.
Yep. Or if you know someone that attends MSU, and send them this episode. And
tell them to inflict violence. And by violence, we mean strongly worded letters. That spell caltrop. CALTROP.
Yep. Anyway, hello, jury. Should we move on with the episode? This is a joke,
everyone, we promise.
Yep. Judge, please don't. we were just inciting. We weren't involved.
If Donald Trump can do it, we can too. I'm just saying.
So true.
Now, much of the work around tree crops in the 70s was focused on energy production because, the energy crisis. And we talked about this before in the past with the American energy farming systems, with the sunchokes, and they had invested heavily in a future powered by perennial ethanol.
Now, that was a good set of episodes we did on that. I didn't finish listening to the last one. Are my stocks in AEFS, are they doing okay?
Yeah, they're doing great.
Okay,
you're good. Just don't call the bank.
Good. Because I put a lot of money into those stocks. I put a lot of my money in there, and it's kind of got to work out.
It's all or nothing right now.
Kind of needs to.
Yeah. So if you haven't listened to that really fun, exciting story about Matt's future, and it's lovely. It's lovely.
Pyramids, the term. Schemes of chokes.
The original MAGA.
Truly.
There was an actual organization called MAGA back in the 70s and 80s that has to do with sunchokes. So, I mean, it's like your favorite things all in one place. Go check it out. So, while we don't know everything about what Dr. James Hanover was doing with his honey locust research, we do know a bit about what he was focused on. He did oversee a range-wide collection of honey locust seed, and he seemed to be trying to build a better database and knowledge center for the genetic and phenotypic variations in honey locusts across its natural range.
I mean, that we could still make good use of today.
Hint, hint, college kids that don't get expelled for besieging or sieging?
Besieging, I think. It does, however, imply that the librarians taking up arms inside to defend the archives.
As they would. They should.
As they will, unfortunately.
As they always do.
As they always do. When you try to besiege a library.
Once you've passed your expulsion? Suspension, yeah, we'll go with suspension. When your suspension has
a little siege
settled, here's some good research for you. Let's dig into that. Now, in this alignment of research, institutional research or work on these honey locusts hasn't been really done in the last few years. There has been some, just not the stuff that we would be wanting to see. So like very little breeding work or anything like that. But one thing that seems to be studied is the utility of the seed as a partial replacement for fish meal when raising carp in fish ponds. So for example, up to 20% of the fish meal could be replaced with honey locust pods, or beans rather. And it showed no difference in fish production, how big they got, all that good stuff. It's really an interesting way to utilize the seed, which to this point we've mostly kind of ignored as part of the food of the honey locust. Further, the flowers of the honey locust also seem to be pretty promising. Recent studies have identified new esters, and the extracts have shown anti-inflammatory activity in, quote, superior to aspirin and comparable to other over-the-counter non-steroidal anti-inflammatory aids, naproxen and ibuprofen.
Hell of a quote.
Hell of a quote.
Hell of a quote.
My next tattoo.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've said it once. I'll say it again. I like my dairy like I like my fish. Fed with tree crops.
He's just waiting on that honey locust cheese.
Mm-hmm. I'm really looking forward to it. That sweet
bean cheese.
Bean cheese.
Yeah. While we have largely focused on the sugars of the honey locust pods, again, there are some people working to try to find ways to utilize the beans themselves, including our friend Eric Tonesmeyer, who's on the show this past summer, who's been working to try to utilize them to grind them into flour, turn them into tofu, which is an interesting way to make a very old crop of very modern, hipster food, right?
Yep.
People are working to continue to find ways to convert the calories produced on these trees into viable, scalable, vertically integrated food products that the general public and not just really weird niche people like ourselves would want to consume.
Right. I like my fish and dairy the way I like my humans fed with tree crops. Yeah. How about that for a tattoo?
It's a little wordy compared to
the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Another couple of words in there, kind of a deal breaker.
Just ruined it.
Yeah.
Today, the primary selections for honey locust pod production are Ashworth, Calhoun, Hershey, Big Fatty, and Millwood. Ashworth is a selection made by John Hershey from a tree found in New York. It has 30% sugar content and a melon-like flavor.
Wow.
Hershey is another selection, obviously made by John Hershey, although its origin seems to be a bit lost to history. Some websites refer to contests for this selection, but I haven't found any proof of that, and I'm really suspicious that he would have thrown his own name on something somebody else contributed. Doesn't seem to be his vibe, so I'm not buying it.
Not by Hershey.
Yeah,
to Hershey. Dedicated
to John Hershey. Now, Big Fatty is another cultivar. This one originated
Shout out Big Fatty.
On John Hershey's nursery. Now, this was selected by Zach Elfers, who has been on the show. And it's got uniquely fleshy pods. And speaking of Zach, he also, at his Forest Farm Plants nursery, has a number of improved selections that don't seem to be found anywhere else. His own personal collection that he has identified. And as a place I'd really recommend grabbing some improved genetics from. And it speaks to the fact that there is still a lot of work, and it's not inaccessible to start trying to build your own selections and contributing something to the greater food native perennial crop space.
For sure. And if you want to know what he sounds like, he's been a guest on this podcast before, right?
So you can hear his voice.
And more importantly, what he has to say.
Says you.
Yeah. I know. Just kidding. I just tuned in for those sweet, dulcet tones of Zach's voice.
Yes. Before we wrap up, there have been some reports of reactions to the pods when used in cooking. Seems to be isolated and could be due to diversity in wild genetics, but it's worth noting for allergen-prone folks. The reports seem to be consistently tied to the thornless selections used in landscaping, which fall under inermis. For example, when you're reading the selection names before the popular name they might see on a tree on the sidewalk, you'll see inermis skyline or inermis whatever. We haven't explored the selections developed for urban landscaping because we're in, and not that we don't care about urban landscaping.
It's that we're not interested in it.
It's that Matt threatened me when I suggested we do a part 2 to this.
Yeah. And I now that we're in person,
it's a lot more threatening.
Yeah, I can follow through on my
Why are you
threats.
So much taller than me?
Yeah. Got
when
really
did that
strong
happen?
since you saw me last time.
It's almost like you've been waiting for this one moment.
Almost.
So, yeah, just something to be aware of. With all that said, though, the honey locust does seem, despite being an anachronistic tree that didn't co-evolve with humans, it does seem really well suited for human-led environments, silvopasture, and then all these multifaceted crops that you can get: a protein crop, a sugar crop, a wood crop, all from this same tree, as well as a livestock feed. And that's pretty cool.
That's a pretty well-rounded pod.
It's a really
well-rounded tree.
like it's almost like this pod. It belongs in a podcast.
Almost.
So if you guys want to see sources, citations, all that good stuff, or you want to see the John Hershey first manuscript, go to agroecologies.org, go find the Honey Locust piece, do your thing, have fun, read it, criticize me heavily, preferably, all that fun stuff. And if you don't want to hear this episode without commercials, please go check out the Patreon where you can listen to the content early, commercial free. And then Matt and I are about to go record some Patreon content because we're never together, and we're gonna have fun with that. So if you want to hear that, you can only hear it over there.
But first, I'm gonna fuck Andy up right now.